Hello, everybody. What a pleasure to be here again to do our next series as part of the Words Matter. My name is Tony DiUlio. I'm an attorney based out of Philadelphia, practicing nationally, handling claims for property damage all across the country. For those of you who don't know me, our practice mainly focuses on first party insurance claims, suing the insurance companies, the state farms, all states of the world when they don't pay claims or underpay claims. We're here to help. Our main focus is really making sure we protect property owners when they're going through these situations that they deserve and are required to get paid for. Uh, we want to make sure that they get as much as possible to get their work done. So if you've ever got any issues with that, please let me know. For those of you who don't know that this is part of a larger series, what we're doing with these lunch and learns is providing information to try and give back to make sure that this industry is as good as possible. It is an industry that has some bad apples, some bad information. So we want to get as much good information out there completely free, just to make everybody better off to get the right results in these claims. And there is a right result. There's a right answer when you're adjusting a loss. There is a fact when it comes to, was this roof damaged by hail or not? Was this leak going on for 13 days or less? Those are all facts. It's just a matter of getting to the right answer and figuring out what the cost is for doing it. As always, I take recommendations. If you guys have things that you want to learn about in these lunch and learns, please let me know. And as always, they're always available after the fact on Facebook and YouTube and our website. So let us jump right in here so we don't waste any more time to that was the wrong one, to our Words Matters series. So the whole purpose of this series for Words Matter is focusing on the actual language of insurance policies. Insurance policies are contracts. The words of a contract matter. And you have a duty, a responsibility to know what those contracts say if you are going to be arguing for your insureds to get the proper coverage. If you don't review the policy, you don't necessarily know what is in there. And these policies are all different nowadays. It's not like it was 10, 15, 20 years ago where so many people were using ISO forms. That's just not the case anymore. They're all modifying it, some of them just writing entirely new policies. So make sure you are reviewing them and understanding what's in those actual policies. Uh, this week, we are going to be talking all about loss of use, an ALE, the coverage D provisions, if you will, of insurance policies. It is so often that money is left on the table in ALE and loss of use. It's really wild when people don't recognize the things that can be claimed under this, how to get paid for them. The only thing I would say is probably more uh, ignored in losses or underpaid or not focused on are contents claims for smoke. There's so much that needs to be done for a smoke contents claim that gets left on the table because everyone gets so focused on the structure, but knowing things like the electronics will deteriorate as a result of the smoke and either need to be replaced or I forget the name of the hydro bath that they do to clean those items, but it's really, really important. ALE, though, is so critical right now because with the long delays that are happening in claims, ALE is running out and insureds are left with no further options. We're going to talk about all of that stuff today. The biggest takeaway that I always want people to have is to read the policy, the full phrase RTFP, read the effing policy or read the full policy if you want to be politically correct, is really so important. So make sure you are reading the policies as you're going through this. The Words Matter series has gone through this an entire homeowners policy. We're focusing really on residential claims, but you should go back and take a look at those. As I always put up, here is my direct contact information. That is my cell phone. That is my email. Feel free to reach out. I do get a lot of text messages and a lot of emails, somewhere around 200 emails a day now. I do my best to process them, but truthfully, I'm not always quick with it. I'm trying to figure out ways around that still. And I guess it's a good problem to have that a lot of people want to reach out, but feel free to bug me. If you want to shoot me a text, and if you don't get a response, just remind me, hey, Tony, I didn't get a word back. Can you get back to me? I have no problem with that whatsoever. You're never bothering me. You're never a pest. So please feel free to reach out whenever you need something. I'm happy to do it. As always, I try to start these with a quote. And I was going through a lot of quotes today and actually kind of came up with one of my own because it really felt appropriate. Insurance is in the business of selling bulletproof vests made out of feathers. You feel comfy as hell, but it's not very useful when needed. Uh, Too often, people get locked into this propaganda from insurance companies of, we are your good neighbor, you're in good hands, all of that great stuff. But when the time comes to need that coverage, it's not there. And I'm not by any means saying that's always the case. Insurance does wonderful things for people. They really help them in dire moments. It can be a lot of good, but there's also a lot of bad that happens in insurance. And my goal, again, is just to get back to that right answer for when coverage should be afforded. Last week, we finished up talking about the exclusions. We spent a lot of time talking about wear and tear, why wear and tear is really a overused exclusion, how to get around it, how to explain when wear and tear is actually a cause of loss versus just existing as part of the structure, and how it doesn't affect the fact that this is a covered claim. If you're dealing with wear and tear losses and seeing that and not knowing why carriers keep coming back and saying it's wear and tear versus wind damage, or why it's wear and tear and not, or why it's water and not wear and tear, you should go back and check out that series, or that there was actually two parts for the exclusions. The two-part video on that is worth watching. This week, we are going to be covering coverage D. It is almost always coverage D under policies. I will tell you, and we're even going to go through an example in one of the carriers who has it as coverage C. But coverage D is loss of use and ALE. It's all those kind of extra expenses that come up as the result of a loss, and what you can and should be doing to document that and to make sure you're presenting those claims properly. And first and foremost, really understanding what it is, what the policy covers under that loss of use, how to be arguing for that and explaining it to carriers, because truthfully, they need it. Coverage D is made up of kind of three main categories that you're going to see over and over with these policies as you're reviewing them. Almost all of them start off with additional living expenses, ALE. So if for any reason you don't know what ALE stands for, that's what it is. Additional living expenses really accounts for anything that you are paying over and above what you had to pay for before, simply because a loss has occurred. And everyone recognizes, okay, an easy one is the rental that I need to go buy or rent, sorry, as a result of a claim. My house burns down. I've got to go live somewhere else. I'm now paying for that. Clearly, that is an additional living expense, but there's so much more than just rental. And we're going to go through that because I see it being missed a whole lot. In addition to ALE, there's also fair rental income. So, again, using the easy example of a property that burns down, if you were receiving rental income for renting part of that property out, you can receive that back if you've lost the ability to rent it out. We're going to go through all of these examples. Last but not least is the prohibited use / civil authority provision. This language will come up in two sections of the policy most of the time. You're going to have it under your coverage D, which gives you the actual coverage for it, saying we'll pay you in the event that your property can't be used the way it was supposed to be used as a result of something like civil authority. We'll talk about what that is. So let's take a look at this first really big one, which are the additional living expenses. Uh, First, looking at a policy. As always, we actually want to read the policy. I don't know how many times I've got to say that in these claims, but read the policy. This is an example from Nationwide for additional living expenses. If a covered loss requires you to leave the residence premises, we will pay the required increase in living expenses you incur to maintain your normal standard of living. Payment will be for the shortest time required to repair or replace the premises, or if you permanently relocate, for the shortest time required for your household to settle elsewhere. Payment will not exceed the limit of liability shown on the declarations or 12 months, whichever occurs first. This period of time is not limited by the end of the policy period. All right, so I've highlighted some important parts, not everything that we're going to go through, but some of the big standouts because they are consistent through a lot of policies. And I want to talk about those. And we're going to look at some other policy language and how it plays with this language, either in a similar way or altering it in some fashion. So, first and foremost, under the additional living expense provision, first, we've got the covered loss requires you to leave the residence premises. Okay, first, for those of you who don't know, defined words are either bolded or quoted in most insurance policies. So here we know words like you, residence premises, we, your, all of those are defined terms. We know it because they're bold. But requires is not a bold term, it's not defined. So one of the questions that always comes up with these losses is, well, when is it required that I leave the residence premises? Requiring the leave of residence premises is easy in some scenarios. House burns down, you don't have a house to live in. That's easy. Well, how about issues of when the property doesn't have a bathroom? What about if the property doesn't have heating and cooling? What if the property doesn't have a kitchen? All of these scenarios can create this kind of gray area of, am I actually required to leave? You've got a family with a husband and wife, 4 kids, and the grandmother who lives at the house. And it's a 3 bedroom or a 3 bath house with a half bath downstairs. And all of a sudden, a loss occurs and you're down to 1 bathroom. Well, you've got a family of, in essence, 7 people living in a home with 1 bathroom. Does that require you to leave? That is some of the arguments that you're going to have to show that you're not able to maintain your normal standard of living. And that's, by the way, one of the issues that comes up with these policies. So as you see later, you must maintain your normal standard of living. Everybody thinks that that just talks about, okay, well, what's the other property have to have when it comes to normal standard of living? But the truth is, we can use the language of the policy to say that's the standard for when I have to leave. The standard for when I have to leave my home, when it requires that I leave, is that I can no longer maintain my normal standard of living by staying at the property. Because the policy doesn't define these things, we have to try and use it to the best of our advantage. But remember, when a policy is ambiguous, it is always read in favor of the insured. So in this scenario, when we're talking about what is required, it is whatever is required that's most favorable to the insured. And there's a strong argument that can be made that required the um, talks about the normal standard of living. If you can't meet your normal standard of living, then it is required that you leave your property. All right, so let's keep going. The next is an increase in living expenses. This one is so important. Increase in living expenses. You don't simply get it because it's a new expense as a result of a loss. Let me repeat that. You don't get ALE just because it's a new expense. It needs to be a net increase to what you are otherwise paying beforehand. We're going to go through some of these examples, but if you have expenses, let's call it of an even $2,000 a month for all your normal living expenses, and you have a loss that happens, and you've got new expenses that come in, well, that's great. And that might be part of your ALE, but you have to take into consideration the stuff you're not paying for anymore. Your house burns to the ground. You don't have to pay for your utilities to the property anymore, right? You don't have a heating bill. So now, yes, I've got a new heating bill at a new property that I'm living at, but it might not actually be part of ALE because you might not be paying more than you were before. It has to be an increase. I hope that is crystal clear because it's an issue that we see often. The other aspect of this is an increase in living expenses. Living expenses are things that are necessary to literally provide for your normal living, right? What are things, the expenses that I have purely by existing? And those are things that can fall under ALE. Non-living expenses might be something like, oh, your son pays for, or you pay for PlayStation online for your son. Well, that's fantastic, but is it really a living expense because of adding that cost? Now, you might say, sure, it could be because That's my normal standard of living. Part of my living is paying for online access for my son to play video games. All right, and that's a fair argument. But these are the things you need to recognize are going to get pushback from the carriers. So it's an increase in a living expense that you incur to maintain your normal standards. So let's talk about incurred. And this was one of the questions, and it's going to pop up later, but I want to say it now, and I'm going to say it again later because it's important. Incurred expenses do not require an exchange of funds. Now, this is a hotly contested issue in the insurance world. Do I actually have to pay the check to the other side to incur the cost? Insurance has not done a good job of defining incurred expenses. And a number of carriers recognize that fact and they come in and they say, look, incurred expenses, it doesn't require the check, it just requires a contract. A realm that has done a much better job is the realm of accounting. As you can imagine, in accounting, whether or not expenses are incurred is incredibly important. It's important for tax purposes. And as a result, accounting principles have done a really good job of defining when costs are incurred. And it's relatively universal that one of the accounting principles that is clear is that costs are incurred as soon as they are owed. I'm going to say that again. Costs are incurred as soon as they are owed. It's such an important accounting principle because in the world of accounting, I might sign a contract on December 1st for somebody to do a certain number of tasks. And they might do that task December 15th. And the contract might say that you don't owe payment until 30 days after the work is completed. Well, that's perfectly fine for when I'm actually making the payment, but the cost is incurred as soon as I sign that contract. As soon as that contract is requiring me to do something, that cost has been incurred. So when you've got a situation of roof work being done on a property and the roofer comes out and you sign the contract, most carriers are reasonable people and they'll say, sure, you've incurred the cost because you've signed the contract. Here's your recoverable depreciation. Some might say, well, look, we need the work to have been started, or we need to show that you spent the actual cash value. And all of those, in the end, it's perfectly fine. I don't really have an issue with a carrier saying, look, if you've signed the contract, you've spent the ACV, that's enough to show incurred. Where I have a problem, and really there's no support for this position as far as I can find, where a carrier says, now you have to actually spend the dollars out of your own pocket to recover the depreciation. That's insane because I might not have that money. There's a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck that pay the ACV to a contractor. The contractor does the work, and now the contractor's owed that depreciation, and they don't have the money. But they shouldn't have to have the money. That's why we have insurance. We've got a contract that says we owe you. The work has been completed. Insurance companies pay the freaking depreciation. It's nuts to me that insurance companies to this day are still trying to say, I need to actually pay that amount to the contractor. That's not why we have insurance, and that's not what it's intended. And candidly, it's not what any accounting principle says when it comes to incurring costs. So, incurred costs are incurred as soon as the money is owed. That's it. Uh, maintaining your normal standard of living. This might seem obvious to everybody, but it actually comes up as a contested issue in a lot of these claims. Your house burns down and you have a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home, single family. Great. My normal standard of living is not a 2-room apartment inside of a hotel. That's not my normal standard of living. The insurance company owes you to maintain that normal standard of living. Now, there's also some level of reasonableness that I want everybody to appreciate. Insurance companies cannot just create homes. There is a market out there for homes that are available to be rented for any given situation. You can work with ALE companies. There are great ones, great recovery, disaster recovery, for example, great companies out there that provide ALE services to provide these homes. But there's limitations. You can't just say, look, insurance company, I'm so sorry. You haven't been able to find me my four-bedroom, two bath house. So now you've got to pay me some exorbitant amount of money as a result. There is reasonableness of distances from your original home and ways to compensate for it. So let's say, for example, they find you a four-bedroom, two-bath house, but it's an extra 15 minutes away from your work. Okay, if that's the best that is available, the insurance company is not doing something wrong, because they can just say, look, we're going to pay you for that extra distance, right? You're traveling extra time. That is part of your additional living expense. We're going to pay you for that. They can work out that balance in the end as a result. So know that they do owe you for that normal standard of living, but there is a level of reasonableness that everybody should recognize is part of that. It doesn't have to be perfect. This last one might be the most contested issue. I don't know. I'd have a hard time between incurred and the shortest time required, but they are by far the two most contested issues when it comes to ALE. Because the next phrase is payment will be for the shortest time required to repair or replace the premises. So let me give you the situation that causes the problem. You've got a loss that burns your house down to the ground. You are working with your insurance company, and your insurance company has taken 4 to 5 months before they've provided an initial payment that could substantially allow you to start work on the property. At that point, you contact a contractor or three to get quotes. It takes you a month and a half to get quotes in, and you choose your contractor. Now, your contractor goes to the city and the township, and they get permits requested from the city, but the city is slow, and they don't get you your approved permits for another month and a half. All of a sudden, I'm going to do this in my head. If it was 4 months to get the payment, a month and a half to find your contractor, and a month and a half to get permits, you're at 7 months before the project has even started actual hammer to nail work on the property. Now, first and foremost, the construction project starts as soon as you sign that contract and they start getting permits. That's the start of the project. But regardless of that fact, you're now 7 months in before any physical work has started at the property. And the insurance company, during their 4 months when they were adjusting the claim, said, well, your project should only take 4 to 5 months in total. That sounds all well and good, but the reality of the world has not allowed that to happen, right? The contractors were a little slower getting quotes to us. The townships or the cities were slow getting us permits. So now all of a sudden, a project that the carrier says should be 4 to 5 months doesn't even start until we're 7 months after the date of loss. When is this shortest time required? Is required in a perfect world what could be done? No, of course not. Required is what is actually necessary to do the job. Insurance companies cannot just say, oh, well, we think it should only take 4 to 5 months, so that's all we're going to pay you. No, because what's required is longer than that. The permits took longer. The quotes took longer. There have been delays because of the weather. Required doesn't just say this is what we think it could do, so that's our shortest time required. It's what it actually is going to take. Now, there are limitations on that as well. Insureds cannot create delays in their own claim and expect to get paid for it. So you get 3 quotes from contractors in October, and you don't make a decision until next February. I am so sorry, insured. That one's on you. You can't just sit on it and do nothing and expect the insurance company to continue paying your ALE. You need to be taking reasonable steps to move this claim along and not just trying to milk it. But truthfully, you never should be trying to milk it because there are pretty strict limitations on ALE within your policy limits. So you don't want to hit that limit. And we're going to talk about options when you do, but you don't want to hit that limit. So make sure these claims are moving. There is little doubt in my mind that as of today, probably the primary issue in all of claims adjusting, and by the way, I mean claims adjusting public adjusters and the carrier side. The biggest problem is the time it takes to adjust a loss. Public adjusters are not moving claims as quickly as they should, and carriers are not adjusting losses as fast as they should. And I'm not saying it's everybody, by the way. Just because you're hearing this doesn't mean you're moving claims too slowly, but you might be. There's a solid chance that you are not doing this as quickly because you've got too many losses on your plate. And you're going to say, well, it's the carrier. I sent them a letter and they haven't responded for 30 days. Great. Well, what have you done to follow up? Did you call them too? Right? Did you send an email and say, hey, I didn't get a response to this. What's going on? Did you try to talk to a manager? And I get it. I know your response. I can hear you saying it. Well, I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to jump through hoops to get a response from the insurance company. I agree with you. I'm with you. It would be great if you didn't need to do it, but sometimes you do. Just as much, by the way, as they need to do with you. Insurance companies will often say, well, I didn't get responses from the public adjuster. Well, insurance company, what were you doing to follow up on that? People aren't perfect. People miss things. People forget stuff. And people are overwhelmed. A lot of us are overworked and we need reminders. And it's the unfortunate reality of the world we live in. So you need to be doing what you can to move these claims along just as much as you expect the insurance company to be doing the same. All right, my little vent. All of this comes back to say that the shortest period of time required is what is actually necessary, not just in a dream world of perfection of, well, we paid you on January 1st, so you should have started construction on January 2nd. That's insane. That's not how the real world works. Make sure you are having those arguments appropriately. So we see this language in a nationwide policy for by way of example. Let's take a look at another one from Allstate. As you will see here from the Allstate policy, they've got a lot of the similar language. This is actually cut off for me a little bit as a result of some of the info at the top, so I'm going to move it over. I'll bring back my pretty face for everybody. Kidding, totally not. Uh, this policy has, first and foremost, we will pay the reasonable increase. Now, note, by the way, the distinction between the nationwide policy, which they said they pay for the required increase. We're now looking at the Allstate policy, which says we will pay for the reasonable increase. That reasonableness requirement we talked about before is spelled out here in the Allstate policy. Reasonable increase in living expenses necessary, now we're back to the necessary, to maintain your normal standard of living when the loss occurs to the property. And it makes your residence premises uninhabitable. So that word uninhabitable didn't come up in the other policy. With nationwide, it is now here. So in nationwide, we've got covered loss requires you to leave the residence premises. Allstate is which makes your residence premises uninhabitable. Truthfully, language is different, outcome and concepts are the same. I've got some law on this, which we'll talk about in the question section. But again, uninhabitable means you can't maintain your normal standard of living. You can't keep living there the way you did before, and the home cannot be resided in. Taking a look further down the Allstate policy, we will pay for the time period required to repair or replace the property we cover using due diligence and dispatch. Well, this is now, again, spelling out that reasonableness standard. This isn't just about what's the fastest anyone could ever do it. It's all right, what is the time that's going to be necessary, required to do this if we're really trying to get it done? I hope that makes sense, but point is, don't just sit on it. But it also means you don't have to do it the fastest possible way if there are slowdowns that are outside of your control. It's also got the limit of the shortest time for your household to resettle elsewhere, or 12 months, which is similar to the nationwide policy. Now let's take a look at State Farm's language. Now here I note that State Farm uses the language in coverage C. I know I've talked about this as coverage D, but State Farm is unique. They call it coverage C rather than coverage D. They again use the word uninhabitable, and we will pay for the reasonable and necessary increase in cost incurred by an insured to maintain their normal standard of living up to 24 months. All right, well, State Farm, at least you've got a little bit more time. You've done something good. It happens once in a blue moon. So let's talk about this. We've got uninhabitable language again. Fine, we've talked about that. But now we've got reasonable and necessary. Personally, I find this to be somewhat redundant, but the reasonable and necessary language uh, all gets us to the same concept. I'm doing it because I have to, and it's not unreasonable what I'm asking for. Fine. State Farm also spells out something that no one else actually spelled out at the very end here. Any normal expenses that are reduced or discontinued due to a loss insured will be subtracted from any amount owed. Again, this is the general concept that everybody understands, but State Farm spells it out. If you don't have an expense anymore from your normal house, you don't get to just add it in still when you have the additional living expenses. If you don't have utilities anymore, that amount is going to come out of your total expenses. What you need to figure out, this is the easy math. What were the total living expenses a person had before the loss happened? Total number. What is the total number of living expenses they now have after the loss? That difference is your additional living expense cost. It is not a comparison of, well, here is everything I had before. Now I've got these new things, and now I get paid for all those new things. I hope that makes sense because you don't get to count the expenses you don't have anymore. Let's take a look at an example. I think that's the next slide are my examples. Yeah, I did it. Oh no, I'm sorry. Damn it. The main takeaways. I thought I remembered my own slides. Main takeaways. Number one, to get additional living expenses, you must be required to leave. The home must be uninhabitable. Those are saying the same thing, by the way, because if it's uninhabitable, you are required to leave. Number two, there must be an increase in your expenses. So a net increase in all of your expenses. Number three, it must be incurred. And again, incurred meaning that you owe it, not that you have officially exchanged the funds in cash to someone else. Number three, it is to your normal standard. I'm sorry, number four, normal standard of living. So you're not going to live in a hotel for 10 months when you've been living in a 4-bedroom house. Number five, the shortest time required isn't talking about the shortest possible time, but when using reasonable diligence, what is the time it is actually taking? That's what's required, not just someone's guess on the time. All right, so we'll take a look. Oh man, I still don't, the examples come further down. I'm way off now. So I created something that I think is really, really useful. It is completely free. You can have access to this. Anybody that is on this call, literally anyone that searches the internet, if you type in WDB Legal ALE checklist, you can find this on our website. There's a blog post that has a link directly to it. But this checklist, in my opinion, every single person that is an adjuster on a claim should have in their folder when they go investigate a loss. And they can sit down with the insured and talk to them about these questions. And it is just a checklist, a yes or no, as to whether or not they are incurring a cost, if there's something that they need to worry about. And there's a nice comments section over here that you can also put in any comments. What is the added cost? Who's the company? Any information that you want. Again, this is completely free to everybody. There's no reason on the planet you should not be using this as part of the adjustment of your claims. Uh, by the way, and I didn't say this in the beginning, but I think it's generally clear. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the comments section. I will do my best to address them. Sorry that I didn't say that earlier, but the chat section is always a great place to put those questions because you can get live answers right now. It's one of the benefits of being here. All right, so let's go through this checklist one by one so that we can really understand some of the things that can come up. Rent for temporary housing. This is the no-brainer. If you can't live at the property, you've now got added rent. You should be checking that. But what about getting the insurance policy for that rental? That's an additional living expense, and it can absolutely be recovered as part of the loss. Or storage of items. If you've got a storage unit, that's a great item for ALE. Credit check fees. So there are often, when you go to have a rental, the landlord will say, we need to check your credit, and there's an $80 fee for that. That is an additional living expense and something that can be charged to the insurance company. Cell phone overtime charges. This isn't an issue so much anymore. This list was probably a little dated. Most people, I think, have unlimited cell phone, but if they don't, If you've got overtime charges dealing with a claim, that is something that can be charged as an additional living expense. So, hey, I've needed to spend an extra, 2 hours on the phone with an adjuster, with my insurance company, with the talking with the PA, talking with contractors, whatever it is. That is something that can also be charged. Here's a question from Jason. uh, if the carrier, due to low estimates, causes delay, slash, considering appraisal or litigation, likelihood of extra contractual amounts of ALE, uh, and he added, or carrier uses ALE to force settlement of coverage A threatens homelessness. So this is one of the things that absolutely comes up, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But if the carrier has underpaid a loss and you need to continue to adjust that claim and can't start the work until the adjustment is finished, that absolutely continues the ALE timeline. But you still have those limits that you're going to need to worry about. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to some of the questions, because that was a common thread. All right, so let's keep going down this list. Costs for a new cell phone if none was used before. Let's say you've got some elderly people who just use a landline in your home. Again, probably less common nowadays. Pretty much everyone I know has a cell phone, but let's say they did. They have to get a cell phone now rather than get a landline at a property where they are moving. They can have that as an additional expense. Mileage between the temporary house and all locations visited to rebuild, or relating to a business, furniture stores, mortgages, banks, construction. All of that mileage is an additional living expense. There are apps. I didn't know this actually. There are apps that you can get on your phone that track the distance you're going. So there's one called Mile IQ. If you guys need this, Mile IQ will track your GPS and all the mileage that you have, whether it's associated with a loss with your business or otherwise, so that you can then put that in with the insurance company as part of your ALE payments. Mileage increase for regularly traveled places. We talked about before, maybe the place they find you is 15 minutes further from your work. Okay, if that's the best we can do, so be it. But you've now got to pay me for that additional mileage that I'm traveling as a result of this new home. Meals eaten out on rebuild related business. So if you're out and meeting with contractors and having lunch, that's ALE. If you are now having to eat out and go to restaurants because you don't have a kitchen, that's ALE. All of those are added costs. IT fee charged to set up a new computer system at your temporary property. Sewer fees at your temporary location, new accounts or setup fees for utilities. All of these things account for new expenses that you didn't have before. So you had Verizon at your home, you're now transferring it to your new property, and Verizon is charging you $80 to do that. That's ALE. If you give this list to your insureds when you are adjusting the loss, would nearly guarantee, I never guarantee anything, I'm a lawyer, but I would nearly guarantee that you're going to come up with more ALE expenses that can be reimbursed from a carrier than if you just try to ask them, hey, what are new expenses that you didn't have before? Photocopies and mailing expenses relating to the claim, moving costs, reconnection fees for connecting services back to your lost location, right? They're turning the water back on, there's fees, gas back on, there's fees, internet, there's fees. These companies charge for everything. So make sure that you are putting that forward to the insurance carrier. What's so nice about this, and I didn't put this in any of the slides, I didn't really think about it until I was talking this out, is your ALE under most policies is limited by time, not by dollar value. Now, there are carriers that have dollar value limits within ALE. It's not impossible, but the more I see time limits, which means there is no dollar value limit. You don't have to worry about a dollar value running out your ALE if you've just got a time frame limit. So don't feel like, oh, I really don't want to put in for these reconnection fees or the setup costs because I don't want to run out of ALE. That's not how it's going to work when there's a time limit ALE limit. I think this is the last one. Cleaning fees from move out from temporary property. If those are charged forward to you, that could get reimbursed. Pet boarding, restaurant meals if eating at home was your prior standard. Cost of doing laundry, time spent handling claims issues. And this last one is relatively unique, and I don't think many people actually bring it up. But if property owners are spending time dealing with this loss and they are losing out on the opportunity to I don't know, do other work, do other things that they would normally be doing, that's an additional living expense so long as you can show that they've lost out on other work. For example, they're a contractor, they dealt with this for an entire day and they didn't get paid for that. That would be ALE as well. So let's take a look at an example. This is obviously very, very simplified. I don't believe most claims that involve ALE would ever only include rental income and food expenses. But I can tell you from experience that 90% of what I see when someone sends me ALE, all they're looking at is the rental and the food expenses. There is usually more that is on the table if you are properly looking at this chart and these other opportunities for ALE. So, if anyone throws this in the chart in the chat, what you think using this information, normal expenses, a mortgage of $1,500 a month, food expenses of $300 a week, and now they've got new expenses where their rent is $800 per month and their food has gone up to $550 a week. Now, almost everyone who's an adjuster does math on a pretty regular basis. So I'm going to talk for about a minute here and give you an opportunity to tell me in the chat what you think the loss of or the ALE, I'm sorry, what the ALE would be for this claim. Shouldn't take too long with the math, but I'm very curious for you to sit there, grab your calculator on your cell phone, on your computer, whatever it may be, put in the chat what you think the ALE amount is. While you're doing that, Jason had asked another question. How are you proving lost income if client is not W-2? Well, look, there's a lot of ways beyond W-2 to show income amounts. Get bank statements, right? You can do the math yourself. You don't need an accountant. Show, hey, showing deposits into the bank account on average of X dollars per week or X dollars per month. If you break that down on a daily cost, that is, $150 a day, $400 a day, whatever it is. So you can use just their own deposits showing that. And it does get tough. Look, if you've got somebody who is a someone who works for cash a lot, contractors, things like that, you might not be able to prove it. And it's unfortunate, but if if you can't prove it, you can't prove it. Try to come up with creative ways to do it by showing things like their own bank statements. A few of you are starting to throw in what the numbers are. So let's take a look at the math. I don't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head, but that's why I do these. I hope I didn't do the math wrong because two of you came up with 150,000, or it was 150. I wish it was $150,000. $1,050. That's not quite the math. Before they had their mortgage of $1,500 and they have the food of $300 a month. Now, maybe it's because I didn't make this clear, but obviously they are still going to have to pay the mortgage while the property is being repaired. Their food expense has gone up to $550, which is a weekly difference of $250. Before, my total monthly expenses was $2,700. Maybe this is where it tricked you. That food expense is per week, not per month. After, my monthly expenses are $4,500 because I'm paying my mortgage, I'm paying the rent, and I've got an additional, in essence, $1,000 a month in food expenses. In total, that gets us to an ALE payment of $1,800. If anyone has a question of how I did that, please let me know. I'm happy to explain it further. I don't want to necessarily spend all the time on it, but if you're taking this out, Jason admitted that it was the week month difference that really threw it off. That wasn't meant to be a trick, but it is important. You got to pay attention to those details. RTFP indeed. So $1,800 is the distinction. If you've got questions how we got there, please let me know. All right, we're cruising along, always taking a little bit longer than I wanted to. Let's take a look at the next section of coverage D, fair rental value, because this one does come up a lot. This is an example from Nationwide. Fair rental value. If a loss covered under this section requires occupants to leave the part of the residence premises rented to others or held for rental, we will pay its fair rental value. Payment will be for the shortest time required, and then we get into the repairs and everything else. So, really big parts of this. First and foremost, hopefully everybody knows this. If you have a homeowner's policy, you are allowed to rent out portions of your property. If you've got a bedroom you want to rent out, if you've got a suite on the back that you want to rent out, go to town. You are allowed to do that. You still must reside at the property, and whether or not you reside is talked about in other speeches I've done, but just regular contact, I won't dive into it, but you can rent it out. You're allowed to rent out the property, so feel free. You can get rental income if you are actively renting it or holding it for rental. We had a case where an insured had rented out or bought a property, lived in it, decided, I'm going to move out and I'm going to start renting this property. They move out, they list it for rental, and unfortunately, a loss happens that makes the property unrentable. They hadn't actually rented it yet, but it was held for rental. It was listed. It had literally never had a person stay in it. It didn't matter. The property was held for rental, and that was enough for it to trigger the fair rental income. And that's the last portion of we will pay its fair rental value. Now, obviously, a fair rental value is whatever you actively were renting it for before. That's kind of a no-brainer. But what if you've got a situation where it's a shore property, second home, and it's going from April, or let's call it even earlier, February, all the way through August for the repairs? Well, the fair rental value in February at a shore property is nowhere near what the fair rental value of that property is in June, July, and August. So you've got to make sure you're accounting for that appropriately. And by the way, that doesn't mean you get June costs in February, but it also doesn't mean you get February costs in June. You should be taking that into consideration. One other one to take a look at is State Farms. The loss insured causes that part of the residence premises rented to others or held for rental by you to become uninhabitable. We will pay its fair rental value, and they go back into the shortest time. Very similar language here from State Farm, so a lot of the same issues. An important thing to note, if you have a loss that just makes even one bedroom uninhabitable, that might not normally give you ALE under a claim, but if it's that one bedroom that was now rented, all of a sudden it becomes a claim for ALE under coverage D. The last section of coverage D doesn't come up nearly as often. Candidly, it's pretty rare. It was hotly contested in the COVID litigation, but otherwise hasn't really come up. It's for prohibited use. If civil authority prohibits your use of the residence premises because of direct damage to neighboring premises by a peril insured against in this policy, we will pay the resulting loss for up to 2 weeks while use is prohibited for additional living expense and fair rental value. So, what does this mean? Your neighbor has a fire on the block, and as a result, there were a question of some chemicals that were in the basement, and the city's shut down the block and evacuated everybody for a week while they're investigating the claim. If you aren't allowed in your property, even though there's no damage, nothing at all that happened to your property, but it happened to the neighboring property, you can get paid for that loss. It's really important that the only way that triggers is if the other property has a loss insured against, a peril insured against. This is why the COVID litigation was so contested, because clearly there was civil authority shutdown for businesses, but the question that the courts kept coming back to is, well, did an insurable loss happen somewhere else? And the courts often came back and said, unfortunately, COVID isn't a direct physical loss, therefore it's not damage. I disagree with them completely, but unfortunately, while we were successful in our motions early on, other firms were not as successful, and there was some bad law that was created. So just know that if the property gets shut down as a result of government authority, you can get some coverage. Taking a look at this was State Farm's language. Again, it's not to exceed 1 week, but I wanted to point out something in this language that was different. Theirs was within 1 mile of the property. So the damage needs to have occurred within 1 mile of the property that causes the civil authority shutdown versus the nationwide language that talked about a neighboring premises. So just know, read the policy. I don't know if I've made that crystal clear or not. So with the last time, as always, everybody sends a lot of great questions that I want to talk about. Some of them are directly on point with ALE. Some of them have nothing to do with ALE, but are issues that are coming up somewhat regularly. If you've got any questions, always throw them in the chat. And I always try to address anything that you guys send ahead of time. But I always start, to the best of my ability, with the ones that relate to the topic. So this one was from an adjuster who knows a ridiculous amount about policies. And I think he was more asking just to create a concept. I don't even know if he's on, but it was Matt Mulholland. If you don't know, Matt runs a school that teaches public adjusting and is really fantastic, and you should check it out. By the way, he didn't plug me in any way for that. I truly believe in what Matt does. So he asked, when is something rendered uninhabitable? It actually triggered the question for me because I don't know. I didn't know if there was any law. I certainly hadn't seen any on defining when something becomes uninhabitable. And I remembered why once I started digging into this a little bit further. This is an example from a Pennsylvania court. And from what I could see, most states were similar to this, but it will be state by state. So check with your local lawyers. If you have a question about a state, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to take a look. But the courts came back and said the court has declined to establish rigid standards for determining habitability and its breach of its builder's vendor-vendee context. Instead, they defined habitability in terms of contemporary community standards and the breach of the warranty as to whether the defect prevented the use of the dwelling for the purposes intended habitation. Little complicated, but in essence, they're saying we're not going to create a standard. It's on a case-by-case basis. So one of the famous things in the law when everyone goes to law school is this court decision about pornography. And the Supreme Court came down and said, we're not creating a definition for pornography. And what they said is, you know it when you see it. And it's a super famous decision. And it's really always joked about in law, really in any context. And this is another one. That when a property is uninhabitable, it's on a case-by-case basis, and you know it when you see it. But here's what I can tell you from experience. Homes that don't have bathrooms are uninhabitable. Homes that don't have kitchens are uninhabitable. Homes that don't have HVAC, heating, cooling, or utilities, electric, gas, are uninhabitable. Those are the easy ones. Homes that really reduce your normal standard of living is when it starts getting in the gray area. But in my eyes, and candidly in the eyes of the law, when there's a gray area of, in essence, an ambiguous area under the policy, it's read in favor of the insured. So you can make arguments that if they can't maintain a reasonable, normal standard of living, that it is uninhabitable. Any questions on that, please feel free to let me know. All right, how to get ALE term limits extended if the carrier forces appraisal and related delays in repair and prevents the insured from resuming residency prior to term limit expiration. In other words, this is what Jason, I think, was asking about is, well, there have been delays that the carrier has created that have caused us to go beyond our ALE limit. For those of you who don't know, I'm very actively involved in some organizations, including APIA, which is the American Association of Public Insurance Adjusters, and MAPIA, the Mid-Atlantic Public Insurance Adjuster Association, that does lobbying efforts all across the country and locally regarding adjusting. And as a result of that, I've gotten to speak with legislators and insurance departments regarding a lot of issues and created good relationships. And I just had a meeting the other day where I asked this question of an insurance department representative who reviews all of the claims that you guys submit for losses. And he told me the same thing that I kind of knew. He said, look, if the insurance company created the delays and they are now cutting off ALE and their limits, but they can't let the person back in their home, let them know. And I know there are a ton of complaints that go to the insurance department unanswered. I'm with you. And a lot of them should go unanswered because you guys are complaining about things that insurance departments don't care about. But this is an issue that they actually do care about. So if you go to them and say, look, I can prove to you the delays are their fault and not mine, you've got a shot at the insurance department telling that carrier they need to extend the limits. But here's the deal, everybody. You can't be part of the problem. If you haven't documented the hell out of your file, showing emails, phone calls, documentation of conversations, proving that you're doing everything you can to move this thing along, they're going to come back and say, it's not the carrier who's delaying it, it's you. Or you're at least part of the problem and there's nothing I can do because of it. So this is why I said it's so important to be doing what you can to push claims along. If you do, you've got an avenue to potentially, just maybe get the ALE limits extended. I want to express it is difficult, sometimes impossible to do it. If the carrier wants to put their foot down and say, we're not extending ALE, there's next to nothing that you can do to force it to happen outside of that complaint to the department. Even calling me, which I highly recommend. If you've got a problem, you can give me a ring, but I can't force them to keep paying while we fight over an issue. So you need to be doing everything you can to move this claim along to get this property back to where it needs to be to help the property owners. Um, would you say that this is one from Jason again? Would you say that appraisal / litigation is a reason for delay and expansion of limits? Generally, no. And here's why. The policy legally allows them to go to appraisal. The policy legally allows two parties to contest the issues of a claim. As long as they're not being unreasonable, right? Bad faith, they're allowed to say, we don't agree with you. There's nothing that can be done to fight that. Now, if they are being unreasonable, if there is bad faith, great. But even in that scenario, I can't force them to keep paying while we fight. I hope that is clear. And it is heartbreaking for some of these policyholders. I get it. They don't have a choice. They don't have the money to live somewhere else. They don't have the money to fix the house. What are they supposed to do? The answer is you've got to just fight it and do whatever you can in the interim to keep surviving. And it's a shitty answer. I get it. But that's the best we can do unless you step in with the insurance department and say, look, we've done everything reasonably. Here's the documentation. The carriers changed adjusters 8 times. They've delayed this thing without explanation. Step in and do something, insurance department, please. And you've got a shot. Again, not a guarantee, but a shot. There's Howard provided a comment. There's a great case in Massachusetts, Pettit versus Vermont Mutual, where the court noted the period of restoration to include the time spent in adjusting the claim, including litigation and appraisal. That's fantastic. I don't know if that overcomes the policy limits issue. I'm going to take a look at that case, and I really appreciate that, Howard. But it at least allows it to continue being paid. Let's say I have to sue them and it's been 6 months. That next 6 months while we are in litigation can still get paid. That's fantastic law, assuming that that's what the case is actually saying. I really appreciate that, Howard. All right. Hopefully you're understanding. Do everything you can to keep this moving. Don't let them delay it to the best of your ability. Insured had a loss of use coverage on the house totally destroyed. Rental property. Insured's son lived in the house in exchange for working for the insured. Company denies loss for rent claim. This was a bartering situation which we believe to be covered. There is no question in my eyes that this is covered. And actually spoke with the adjuster that was on this morning. I don't know if he's on this right now, but we talked briefly about this, and it is covered. There's no question. It's a covered loss, and there's loss of rental income. The problem that he has, and that is maybe obvious, is how do you value that? What is the value for that bartering system? And we talked about some options. Number one is, what's the value of the services provided at the work, right? What is, even if we call it minimum wage, what is the minimum wage value for the hours that he has put in? Because that's what is going to have to happen instead. Right now, they're either going to have to start paying the son or bring someone else in to do the work because they don't have the house to give them to live in anymore. That's a great way to try and value it. The other way, which the adjuster also came up with, and I don't disagree with, is, well, what's the fair rental value of that property? We talked earlier how the policies talk about fair rental value, that in essence, get a realtor to come in and say, this is the fair rental value, and use that as the measure of damages. Both of those are fair representations, and the carrier should be paying that claim. The next one we've got as we're rounding down, definition of incurred. We talked about this. Reiterating it now, incurred, based off of nearly every accounting principle out there, is when a cost is owed. As soon as it is something that you owe, it has been incurred, meaning when you sign that contract or when the work is done, however you want to measure it, it is owed. When there's a verbal agreement for payments, that's not enough, guys. Insurance companies are allowed to change their mind. This is hard news for a lot of you. They're allowed to tell you, oh, hey, I think this is a covered loss. We'll get the payment out. And then a week later, they say, oh, I reviewed it more. I don't think it's a payment anymore. They're allowed to do it. What they're not allowed to do is get the insured to do something as a result, to hire a contractor, to get work started, and then say, I'm changing my mind. That's called estoppel. They're not allowed to do it. But otherwise, they are. Non-traditional form of rent payment. I think we just talked about that, so I won't belabor the point. You got to find a way to monetize it. And again, using the fair rental value, which is in the policy language, is a reasonable basis. So if you don't have a normal term for your rent, go get a realtor, find out what the fair rental value is, and use that. Here's a great question that comes up. Now we're in it doesn't talk about ALE issues, but I think all of these questions are pertinent. What documents are reasonable requests from the carrier? The carrier is allowed to ask for reasonable documents as part of their investigation, and the insured is required to comply. Excuse me. Here's what I will tell you. If you can get it, just get it. Don't fight over whether or not it's reasonable or not reasonable. It's just not worth it, right? If they want to look at something, let them look at it. We shouldn't be in the business of trying to hide things. And I know the answer. I know what you're going to say is, well, if I give it to them, they're going to use it wrong. They're going to use it the wrong way and they're going to deny the claim. You know what? They might do that. But that's where we have to just keep fighting them. And you can't be the person to say, we're going to withhold information because we're afraid of what we think the insurance company is going to do with it. If you've got the info, send it to them. But that doesn't mean you have to bend over backwards to get it. If they want you to say, well, look, give us all of your repair receipts for the past 30 years you've owned a house, that's ridiculous. I couldn't possibly give you all of the repair receipts for the past 30 years of the property. Sure, maybe I can get you the past 3 years. That's reasonable, but not 30. So what's reasonable is really comes down to, can you just get it? And it doesn't make it reasonable to ask, but there's really no reason to fight it. Otherwise, reasonableness relates to whether or not it can actually change an opinion in the case. In the legal world, it just has to relate to a relevant piece of evidence. So it's reasonable to ask for things that might be relevant as part of the claim. So you can't really hold back that much. All right. Take a look. Is a typical HOA condo damage policy treated as a secondary policy, which covers a unit owner's dwelling only after the unit owner's primary dwelling coverage meets the HOA's damage deductible threshold requirement? HOAs are a nightmare. I despise HOAs. I think most of you probably hate working with a HOA situation, but it is part of the world we live in and we all deal with it. Here's what I will tell you. Take a look at the master deed and the bylaws. The bylaws will generally provide you the information of what is primary and what is secondary. If you take a look at those, that's going to give you your answer. It's a nightmare. It's annoying to look through them, and a lot of them look like they were made in 1942. But the truth is, that's where you're going to get your answer because there isn't usually a standard across the board. So take a look, and the case law is different state by state. What I can tell you is on a state specific issue, talk to an attorney and review the bylaws. We can provide that for you. The forced place policy. Insurance company has stopped communications last Christmas. So we're now 4.5 months later. Made multiple phone calls and emails to the adjuster and her supervisor how to get them to re-engage and to send the full policy. You might not be able to. Forced place policies are a tricky beast. The question comes down to whether or not the property owner has any interest in the policy. And the way they have interest in that policy is if it has limits over and above the mortgage amount. Most of them do. Let's say, for example, the mortgage is down to $200,000. Policy limits are $450,000. Well, they have an interest in that policy up to $250,000 because that's what's over the mortgage amount. If you explain that to them, you're an additional insured, you can get them to usually cooperate with that understanding. If not, file a complaint with the department. Say, look, we've made a request for this policy. They're refusing to send it to us. They'll usually respond that way as well. If not, contact an attorney and we may be able to help. Marring, definition and how to overcome objections. I will tell you, go back and check my last webinar. We talked all about wear and tear and marring. I don't want to spend the time again. Here's what I'll tell you. Marring is pretty much every loss that's ever happened to a property, and it doesn't usually come in that often. So go back, watch the webinar, take a look. Last question, client has a policy. They do not provide for a matching due to obsolete material, but the insured purchased extra coverage for O&L. Great job, insured. I got an email from the local building department that all codes are enforced. By the way, you don't need that. It's nice to have, but you don't need it because if there is a code, it must be enforced. You don't only have to drive the speed limit if a police officer is behind you. Am I wrong that the insurer owes for the whole roof since proper building practice and following manufacturer's instructions for overlapping felt on conjunction slopes will damage discontinued shingles on undamaged slopes? So here's the deal. You've got two issues that are kind of coming up. If ordinance and law requires the replacement of the felt underneath the shingles to do it, then you got to take it off. You've got coverage because of the added O&L coverage. If you are dealing strictly, you're not in code anymore, but you're strictly dealing with creating other damage to the discontinued shingles in attempting the repair, then you've got coverage still. If you cannot physically make a repair because of old shingles and new shingles, they owe for all of the shingles. It's not because they're discontinued. That's not why you're doing it. It's not because there's a mismatch. It can't be repaired. I can't physically do it. It would be like saying, hey, I've got this water damage on the wall, and all I want you to do is just kind of move your eyes quickly and you can't see it. So that's good enough, right? That's not real. It's not realistic. Just like you can't make that repair that way. So you've got to get the full roof. It's a repairability issue. There are some states like New Jersey, and if this happens to be a New Jersey case, unfair claims practice says if you can't find a contractor to do the work based off of what the carrier is paying you, the carrier has to give you the contractor. Make them own up to it. Use that language against them and get them to pay the loss. All right. Everybody, I truly appreciate your time doing these. Hopefully, there's value added for you guys. This is my information. Please feel free to reach out. If you have ideas for future talks, let me know. I'm always happy to hear it. Please let me know, guys. Thanks again. Everybody have a great day, a great weekend, and I'll see you soon. Take care.